It's good to be here, and I'm glad you made it out tonight. It was kind of a cold night. I didn't know if anybody was going to show up or not. We may still have some people come in late, which is fine. I brought some books on the subject of reincarnation tonight, and what we're going to do is we're going to sell these and split the money with the lodge. So you'll be helping our lodge here in Detroit by purchasing a book. So if anything that I say tonight strikes a chord, you might be interested in reading a little more about it in those books. How many of you have felt or feel or think that you have experienced memories of a past life? Yeah, quite a few. Yeah, me too. When I was very young, about 3 or 4, I could remember dying in World War II. I was charging up a hill, I believe, in northern Italy, and I was wounded. I've heard people say, other lecturers, that a lot of times if you have molds or birthmarks on your body, that they could be places where you were shot or wounded, shrapnel or bullet wounds or whatever. I had a number of them. I used to have one here on my side of my face, but I had one down in the leg and one here somewhere in the chest. So maybe not. I don't know. Might be related to ideas of quantum physics, which certainly apply to reincarnation. And we'll get into that in a little bit. It's important for us to realize that about half of the world, the latest studies have found that a little over half of the population of the world believes in reincarnation. It's grown over the years and is continuing to grow. I had a terrible experience at the Bed Bath & Beyond just yesterday with the checkout lady who was a fundamentalist Christian, and somehow in the course of paying for this purchase, I told her I was lecturing tonight here, and she said, "What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to talk about reincarnation," and she just threw a fit and couldn't believe that I would waste my time on a subject because it didn't have anything to do with Christianity, when in fact it does. All early Christians believed in reincarnation. It was one of the reasons why they could so easily sacrifice their lives in the Roman arena. It was in the 6th century that one of the ecumenical councils, I believe in Mycenae, 553 or 533, something like that, AD, that they decided they would write the idea of reincarnation out of the Bible, take it away. They wanted people to straighten up and fly right, as it were, in one incarnation and get the job done. It's interesting now that that whole idea is coming back into vogue, and people, they're writing books about it. We have a number of them here in our library and our bookstore that are for sale. Interesting stories of young children born with memories not dissimilar from my own, some with a great deal more detail than what I could recollect in my dreams, my naps in the afternoon that my mother used to make me take on a itchy old burgundy-colored sofa, and I was always kind of on edge, so it might have been a good thing because it made me aware of the astral world, so I didn't go too deep into my sleep. But what we need to get some fundamental ideas across today that are taught by the Theosophical Society and other esoteric schools and organizations, and are really the foundation of the wisdom teachings. And we say that mankind, human beings, are an intermediary force. We see here Vitruvian man, and we see that there are 3 kingdoms below mankind and that there are 3 kingdoms above mankind. and that human beings are, through a series of about 1,000 lives, we say symbolically in the esoteric schools, 777 lives. Hi, Mary, I didn't see you come in there. Glad you made it. 777 lives. And 700 of those lives were kind of wandering aimlessly, but minutely each incarnation. We're getting closer and closer to a goal of completion. And then we have 70 lives where we're making progress. We're gaining traction. And we have then 7 lives that are really and truly our initiatory lives. When we talk about initiation, it's cloaked in the New Testament in the 5 significant events in the life of Jesus. They're hidden in an allegorical story of the birth, the baptism, the transfiguration, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. And that these initiatory events lead us to the 5th initiation, which makes us a saint. The halo nimbus occurs. We are as different from mankind at this level as man is from animals. As different from you and I are as different from a cat and dog. They think of us as gods. I remember letting the cat out one side. Outside, it had been the first snow. This is a number of years ago. The first snow of winter, and he looked at me, the cat, like, "Make it stop snowing. Make that snow go away." Because I could do all these wonderful things like open a can of cat food and, extract water from the faucet to feed him, and miracle things that he couldn't do. So animals sometimes see us as hierarchical beings. Anyway, so thanks, Randy. We're trying to understand this process of reincarnation. We are immortal beings. We are products of the divine. We say that in esoteric parlance that we are a monad or a spark of divine emerges from the one divine being who ensouls our solar system. And that Blavatsky explained it as if we were looking at the moonlight across a body of water, and the shimmering of the waves and the flickering of the moonlight was like the monads who came from the one source and are many. We say that there are 63,000 million monads, that's 63 billion monads, that are seeking expression on the Earth's chain of evolution. We incarnate, we live our lives, we experience life in its tragic forms as well as its good forms and events, and we pass on into another realm. We're going to talk about that realm tonight. This graph here helps us understand it, and those of us who have had a Christian upbringing will understand the story of the prodigal son. And in the Bible story of the prodigal son left the father's house, depicted here by the monad, leaving the flame divine and passing down through involution. Involution is a term that we as theosophists commonly use, meaning becoming involved in the world of matter. And the story of the prodigal son is that the son left the father's house. Our monads left this divine spiritual realm and took on a great epic journey down into the world of matter. And the story of the prodigal son says that he left his father's house and he went on this immense journey to a distant land where he lost all of his things of value, his gifts, which really are spiritual gifts. But he lost his robe, beautiful robe, his jewelry, money, whatever things he had. And he lived with the swine. Symbolically, he lived with the swine. And he tired of this lower world, and then he decided he wanted to go back home to his father. And he began an epic journey which we call evolution, the evolutionary or evolutionary path of return back to the Father's house. And of course, that's what we're talking about over here when we talk about symbolically the final 77 lives. We're seeking that journey back home. Some are, some aren't. All will in the end. So these 63 billion monads that are these sparks of the divine are seeking expression here on the earth chain of evolution. I'll see if I can explain earth chain later. It's a little abstruse. I didn't bring the right graphic, but I've got another one we can substitute. So that's the hypothesis of our talk tonight, is that we are a monad who expresses itself through the soul of man, of mankind, men and women. And we are evolving, some making greater progress than others, some succeeding, some failing, but still making incremental grades of progress, regardless of how small or minute they might be. So, in the process of this tremendous event, I think I just explained the monad, 63 billion. It involves an understanding of the rays, which I talked about, I think, in my last talk here, where about 3 billion rays, monads are on the first ray, and then about 30 billion are on the second ray, and another 30 billion on the third ray. The first ray is the ray of will and power, people who are very willful, have strong personalities, can even be bombastic. Leaders, great leaders, generals, presidents, significant people are oftentimes people of a first ray personality or a first ray soul, but they may also have a first ray monad. And then, of course, there are the second ray, very loving, Christ-like beings who are products of a second ray soul, second ray monad, possibly. Not always, not always. Blavatsky had a I think she was a first ray monad, but she certainly had a first ray soul and a first ray personality. That doesn't mean that just because you have a first ray personality, you're very willful, you have a first ray soul, very determined, leader type, administrative person, doesn't mean you have a first ray monad. You could have a second or third ray monad. But this monad seeks expression, and down through a thin thread attached to the monad down into the higher self, into the planes of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas. We'll see another graph here on the television screen later explaining this a little better. The higher self, the soul, seeks expression. And one of the things that happens in spiritual development as we read and study, part of the third object is to explore the undiscovered powers latent in mankind, is to study, is to meditate, and is to be of service to mankind. And what they don't tell you, in the theosophical teachings, and I think should amplify the teaching, is that each one of those disciplines feeds an energy to a head center, the crown, the brow, and the throat. And when those energies are opening, working equally, they overlap one another. And where they overlap, this creates the lens for the third eye. It's not the pineal gland. It's only part of the story. It's much more abstruse than that. But we have here the personality seeking integration. And the way it seeks this integration is that through its study and through its service to mankind and through its meditation, it creates a bridge, a rainbow bridge sometimes called, the Antakarana. And the Antakarana is a bridge into these higher realms where we begin to have experiences. And some of us have had experiences. I remember being a young guy and coming back from Vietnam, and I was back in college, and I was telling some of the guys who didn't go to Vietnam about things that I had to do, and they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it. And I said, yeah, I was in a company, an infantry outfit, been wiped out numerous times in Vietnam. And we had lost so many people that they were going to send us back to the States, which we were all real happy about. And then the general that was in charge said, no, we're going to operate differently. And what we're going to do is you guys are going to operate as recon. There'll be a reconnaissance group. And of course, the recon guys in Vietnam ran, and there were these other guys that were called divisional LRPs. A LRP is a LRP, is Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol. And that's where they'd go from base camp out to the boonies, but we were already in the boonies, out in the jungle. And so we would run these, what they called short-range patrols, which in reality were long-range patrols, out into three men out into the jungle looking for the enemies over on the Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnam border around a place called Kon Tum province. And one of the things that we would have to do was we would have to be silent for 3 days. You couldn't talk. If you did, it was just a whisper, a faint whisper. And you would be listening mostly for enemy movement and observing when you could. You would try to conceal yourself for obvious reasons because you might run into a huge number of enemy forces, which certainly were there. And you were only 3 people, so you had to have your wits about you. And it's interesting, one of the things that would happen would be your senses, like an American Indian, would be heightened. You would be able to, I could smell, truthfully, I could smell 300 meters away. I could smell the enemy. I could distinguish between Cambodians and Laotians and North Vietnamese. Absolutely true. From as far as 3, and I knew the distance. So there was this strange intuitive thing that came over me, probably a product too of previous lives, that the very reincarnating atoms of my own soul and being were re-experiencing things that I had experienced in previous lives. We've all had many lives in Egypt, in Rome, in difficult situations, in good situations. We have been both male and female. We have been every race imaginable under the sun, every religion. We're going back tremendous distances. The soul truly is about a million-year institution. I used to tell the guys down at the VA hospital that Noel desperandum, do not despair, that you're a million-year institution, and you're going to live out your life, and you'll incarnate again into hopefully better environs than this, better situations than this life. And it gives them a little hope to think in the terms of being immortal. And that certainly is what the monad is, and the soul, its reflection in the outer world, the vehicle that we're using, and its physical equipment. So the whole idea of reincarnation, like I said, is gaining momentum, and I'm only going to briefly talk about this because it's only a part of my subject tonight, but we have 7 centers that we call chakras, not chakras. They are chakras like church, chakra, and that these centers, as they open, especially the higher centers, above the diaphragm, the heart, the throat, the brow, the crown chakra, as those centers open, different energies begin to flow into us. Things like a Buddhic energy, the ability to intuit situations. I was telling somebody earlier here tonight, I don't even remember who it was right now, it was Jan, I think, Jan Dubé. When I was on my way to Vietnam, I was in the Oakland Army Terminal, and of course you're in there with thousands of guys, and they're all waiting to go to Vietnam, and it was just rows of bunk beds, just rows and rows of hundreds and thousands of bunk beds. And the normal procedure was they would bring you into this, it was an old warehouse from World War II to supply the Pacific Theater. They had these big, gigantic doors as big as this building, and they would slide them shut and lock them. And you were in there for 3 days. They'd make hundreds of thousands of dollars off the vending machines. That's all you had. And the normal procedure was to lay in your bunk bed in the fetal position. That's what guys did. And you're talking guys that were 18 years old, 19. I was 20 years old. I was an old guy. I was 20 years old. And I'd laid there for 3 days in the fetal position. And they made an announcement over the intercom and said that there was a typhoon off the South China Sea had moved into Vietnam, and we were going to have a delay, and it'd be a day or two, and they'd let us know. So I decided I wasn't going to lay there in a fetal position in a bunk bed anymore, and I got up and started to walk around, and there was a long hallway. And so I was walking down the hallway. I had no idea where I was going. And I heard billiard balls clicking, and I always liked to play pool, still do. And a small billiard room about the size of this room. Had a couple pool tables, and I looked in, and there were 6 guys in there. I counted them, and I stepped through the threshold of the door, as God is my witness. And I knew when I stepped through that door, and those 6 guys that were in that room, I knew who would live and who would die. I felt close to all of them. It was like I knew them all of my life. The guy that I felt least close to, because he was such a gentle soul, became my best friend. And of the 10,000 guys that were in that building that day, and of these 6 people that were in that billiard room, 6 of the 7, I was the 7th man. They all knew one another. I didn't know any of them. But as I walked through that door and I had that premonition of who would live and who would die, I felt as if I had known all of them before. And the guy that I felt the least close to ended up, 6 of us went to the 4th Infantry Division that was just getting wiped out, completely just getting wiped out. So they needed a lot of people to go to the 4th Infantry Division. One guy, Rocco Luciano, was a blonde-haired, very handsome Italian guy from Brooklyn. And I knew that he was going to die. I knew. And I felt very close to him. And I felt very close, young Jewish kid named Howard Rosendeicher. And I knew that Rosie would die. And about a month in country, you could write to your buddies in country, you know. And you could send mail to America. There was no postage because the government sent it for free. And about a month in Vietnam, the first month, Rocco was killed. And about 10 months went by. And they had this thing called R&R, and you got to go on R&R. So I was going to Tokyo, and I was down at Cameron Bay, and I look up on a little narrow asphalt street about as wide as a sidewalk, and there's Howard Rosendeicher. And I thought, wow, my premonition of him was wrong. And he's alive. He's lived. I said, hey, Rosie. Hey, Zim. A couple of Jewish guys. Hey, man, how's it going? Hey, great. Yeah, he's telling me his story. He'd won the Silver Star for heroism. Got a job driving the colonel around back in base camp. And I thought, wow, Rosie, my premonition was wrong. And Rosie's going to make it, you know. And he had an in-country R&R. So he was just goofing off for 3 or 4 days down in Cameron Bay, which is one of the most beautiful beaches on the planet, bar none. White sand, turquoise water, unbelievable. Vietnam, who knew? So I leave and I go to Tokyo and I come back, and as I'm coming back, my buddy Segrist from the pool room in the Oakland Army Terminal, he's going to Tokyo. So I go back and I'm out in the boonies, and another week goes by and Segrist comes back from Tokyo. He gets off the plane and he's sad. And so what's wrong, Bill? Well, he said, I ran into Tony Suglia down at Long Bend, and he said Rosie was killed. I said, you're kidding, man, I can't be. I saw him down at Cameron Bay. Now he was driving the colonel's Jeep, and he had a landmine blew up and killed him. So my premonition was right. But in the disciplines of the lamasseries of Tibet, the teacher, the monk, will tell you that you will have to discipline yourself. We know of Catholic Church monasteries where they practice silence. I used to buy incense from one in Peosta, Iowa. Beautiful incense, very sixth-ray Catholic smelling incense. And so all of these things, these disciplines that we practice in Buddhism and in spiritual practices, I had to do in Vietnam when I was 20 years old. You couldn't speak. You'd sit in one place for 3 days and don't move because they could get you killed. If you can smell them, they can smell you. Don't smoke cigarettes. Try to eat as little food as possible. Things like that. And you tell people that. Say, yeah, we went out, once a week on a 3-man patrol over into Cambodia. Used to go into Cambodia. I was a point man on Thanksgiving Day, 1968, on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. go into danger. And the danger brings out something from the soul. It brings these qualities and these sensitivities of sight and intuition. And all your senses are heightened, and some people's are heightened more than others. I was saved one night on a hill by a voice that came from the sky. And the voice was neither male nor female. It told me to do something, and I did it. 4 o'clock in the morning, the first mortar round fired, blew the roof off my bunker. While I was going to sleep out on top of the roof of that bunker. The mortar round would have hit me right there in the solar plexus. So my life was saved. And I knew several years after that, I had time to think about it. I knew I had a purpose. I knew there was something I was supposed to do in life. And part of that was to teach this material that we're talking about tonight. And the stress will do that. That's one of the things they tell you in the esoteric schools, is that when you're under stress, your awarenesses are heightened. And it's true. I've seen it many times. It is true. So this whole idea of reincarnation and me meeting these 6 guys in the Oakland Army Terminal, I may have known that in the previous life there was some really incredible force of energy came over me, and they accepted me into their group. They all knew one another. They all went through boot camp together. They went through advanced infantry. I was the outside guy. And they accepted me into that group. And my buddy Bill and I went through the whole thing together. So we have people, usually in families, even in our families, we incarnate as a group. We have connections with our mothers and fathers, our brothers and sisters, and they're products of previous incarnations. And we bring with us those energies and those memories of those experiences from our lives. And I certainly have seen it in my own family. My grandparents, my parents, of things is just astounding. I remember a time, it was there are many ways that we can teach. And we can teach through personal experiences. We can teach through the books we have read. We can teach through the experience of others. There's a lot of ways that we can teach. I have an odd experience of events that took place in my life where my father had abandoned our family when I was about 14 years old and never knew where he was. He had been a successful real estate broker, a lot of money, but he was an alcoholic. He left. And I had a dream one night at a very heightened spiritual time in my life, and in the dream I went to Columbus, Ohio. Without the body, I'd astrally projected. And I knew where I was. And I traveled to a town called Orient, Ohio. I never heard of it. And then I went from Orient, I went to a town called Asheville. And as I'm traveling to these places, thinking Orient, human consciousness is the Orient and the Occident. And I went to Asheville and I said, this is like living and dying from dust to dust, ash to ash. And then I went from Asheville to Circleville. Circles is like the perfect symbol of God and life and the universe. It has no beginning and it the alarm went off, and I felt my bed shake just before the alarm, like somebody was in my room and was trying to wake me. I woke up. I was scared. I woke up. I turned the alarm off at 5 minutes till 5 Indiana time. I got up at 5 o'clock to get ready to go to work. Went to work. Had to start a new job. Incredible series of events happened at my lunch. I won't tell you tonight. I got a phone call, and it was my brother. And I thought, how did he know I was here? I didn't tell anybody. But my brother and I both work for the same company. And he traced down through personnel a woman named Sally Zimmerman, same last name, no relation. And she told my brother that I was at this warranty processing center. I'd been laid off from the design center for this huge trucking company we worked for. And my brother said, hey, Bob, he's died. And I said, you're kidding? I said, where have you been all these years? He said, I don't know. He said, I think he was in Chicago. Aunt Helen called, my dad's favorite sister, his little baby sister, called and said he died. And I said, thing now, I'm going to get off in half an hour, and I'll go. When I get home, I'll call Aunt Helen, and I'll get the details. Okay. So I went back and deep, good Jesuit Art Sislo. Yeah. I said, well, I just got a phone call. My dad died. It's Bob, my brother. He knew my brother. Had worked with me. Styling department. Both got laid off about the same time. And we had a reunion, so it meant I could work in other areas at a reduced salary. So as I left, went home, pulled up in front of my house, my sister pulled in behind me, my oldest sister. She got out of the car and she's crying. I said, well, what's wrong? Well, she said, did you hear about Mom? And I said, no. I said, did you hear about Dad? No. Well, I said, well, Dad died. Well, she said, I just took Mom to the Dumoulin Clinic, and she has advanced cervical cancer and is only going to live about 6 months. I said, well, I'm going to go in and call Aunt Helen. I'm telling you this because it leads to something. And so I got in, I called on the phone and called my Aunt Helen, and I said, Aunt Helen, it's Dave. I said, I understand Dad died. And he said, yeah. I said, well, what's the details? And fortunately, my mother's youngest brother owned a bunch of funeral homes in Indiana. And so when I called him, he sent one of his guys. Brother went down to get my dad's bodies. But Aunt Helen told me the story. I said, well, where is his body? She said, well, he was living outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a little place called Ohio. And his body is in the funeral home in Asheville, Ohio. And his county sheriff's office in Circleville was my dream. The amazing thing about the interconnectedness of these souls, my father, my mother, my grandmother, and everybody, was that my mother died exactly 9 months to the day that my dad died on June 6, 1976. My mother died on March 6, 1977. And my grandmother Zimmerman, who I knew had this karmic link with my mother and with my father, died of the same disease that killed my mother a year later, exactly on the day that my dad died. I can't make this stuff. That's what happens to you when the Antakarana is constructed. And it ain't always bad. It happened with meaning in your life. You write those down in your spiritual diary because they're powerful events. So if you're meditating and you're studying and you're being of mankind. You should also keep a spiritual diary, which I do. I keep a spiritual diary. And I have, like 10 days before the World Trade Towers collapsed, I was meditating in my den and looked up on September 1st, 2001, and there were scale models of the World Trade Towers, about this tall, collapsing right in front of my eyes. I'm awake. I'm alert, just like now, and I see the vision. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I was sleeping, and I was out of body. It projected over the southern tip of Manhattan. And I looked down with my astral vision, and I saw what looked like two tornado clouds. And as I zoomed in on southern portion of Manhattan, I realized that the tornadoes were, in fact, the World Trade Tower. Continuity of consciousness about the disciplines to practice. He says to meditate. He says to be of service. I don't think it says anything about keeping a spiritual diary, but you read the occult classics. You read these books and other esoteric works. Manly Hall, Alice Bailey, Paul Brunton. I saw one of Paul Brunton's books over there. Extraordinary human being. But there are many authors. C.W. Leadbeater, one of my favorites. And these books are products of higher manas, higher mental plane information. That's why you read the classics. And what it does is it stimulates the neurons of the brain, neurons that are dormant. Books will stimulate and activate those dormant neurons in the brain. And sometimes they cause us to have recall or memory of past lives. So, one of the things that, of course, is a product of reincarnation, the sister of reincarnation is karma. And we argue sometimes among ourselves whether it's good karma or it's bad karma. It's karma. It's karma. It's just karma. And sometimes it seems like bad karma. And sometimes it seems like good karma. And sometimes we get into arguments with people and we become upset and disturbed. And my teacher told me, my guru one time said, don't worry about that. Just leave them to their karma. That's all you have to do. You don't have to focus in on Bernie Schwartz and what Bernie said to you at the baseball game or whatever, whatever life brings to you. But what is important is that you just leave them to their karma. And if their karma is good or healthy or whatever you want to call it, fine. And if their karma is difficult, leave them to their karma. That's all you can do. So, this whole idea of reincarnation is that we are the sum total of many lives. Many lives, and it helps explain genius. Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, at age 3, the rabbi gave him a little plastic violin, and Yehudi tried to play the violin, and he threw it to the ground. His father grabbed him, scolded him, and he said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because the violin would not sing. The violin didn't make the sound that he felt was appropriate, what he wanted it to make." So we'd say, well, if he was 6 years old, and he was playing concerts at, venues like Carnegie Hall at 6, and Beethoven and Mozart and others were creating fabulous music at young ages, how do we explain this genius? And we would say, the esoteric schools, one of two things has happened. Either the memory of the reincarnating permanent atom of the previous lives has come into fruition in this particular life, or you've been overshadowed by the muse. The Greeks called it mugenites. Some being is using you for some purpose, and it could be to play music or any other event that you might think of. But through this process, but try to erase this, is that of all of the souls in man, combination of young and old souls, and the young souls make up a portion of this football-shaped symbol of all of the souls seeking expression on the earth chain. And on the other end, at the opposite end of this football shape, are very old souls. My daughter was an old soul. There are people here in this audience tonight who are old souls. And in the middle ground is everybody else who's neither a young soul nor an old soul. So as far as the age of the soul is concerned, we are different. Many souls came from other evolutions within our own solar system. In Theosophy, we read in Anthropogenesis how there were life forms, not physical. They weren't physical yet. They were astral and lived on the moon chain. And that there were even creatures, it's said in the writings of the esoteric schools, that certain animals evolved on the moon chain, marsupials that have pouches, kangaroos and possums and animals like that. And if you think about a kangaroo in this whole evolutionary process, it takes tremendous leaps and bounds, just like a man on the moon can jump a tremendous distance. So this chain of life forms and these monads, when the moon was destroyed, came to the earth. And others have evolved through a system, and still are. They said there hadn't been any animal souls, I think, for 50,000 years. Have not individualized into humans, but may soon begin to do that. It's an interesting thought. This life force of this divine being, the solar logos, is expressing himself through these monads, these 63,000 million or 63 billion monads on our Earth, but other planets have also had life, the teachings tell us. Some come from other planetary systems. Alcyone, the Theosophical Society back in the 20s and 30s, Krishnamurti was said that he came from a star system called Alcyone, and that he was a very highly evolved individual. And when Leadbeater saw him, it's controversial, but I'm a neo-theosophist, and some of the things I say are sometimes controversial. But I believe that I stand by what I say, and eventually, someday, you may realize these things to be true. They have been found true for me. And that he was supposed to be a Christ being. You know, Blavatsky says in her writings, she said, there are Buddhas and Christs galore waiting for incarnation into the world when they have a proper parents, a proper environment for them to come into, and we will begin to see them. The prophecy, the occult prophecy, says 2025. Well, it's 5 years away. 5 years and what? 2 months away. It's 2025. See you later. He had to leave early because he has another engagement, and I'm not making up excuses for him. I think he liked the lecture, but you never know. Yeah, there's a question.
So, when someone passes away, they're saying their soul is waiting for something.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. What happens is at death is that you enter into the astral plane. They used to say about 20 years in the astral plane, 20 years in the lower mental planes. It could be 100 years or more or longer in the Devachan or in higher planes, depending upon how much you have grown through these many multiple lifetimes. And like I say, we're at different stages of development. The real truth is that we aren't all equal as far as the age of the soul is concerned, because some of us are young souls. Some are very old souls. And so we're all at different periods of points of growth in our spiritual expression. And in the process of reincarnation, and with the idea of atavism, which we're going to talk about tonight, is that atavism is where the previous lives have influenced this life. And there are many examples of atavism coming in and experience, whether it was what I just talked about. I talked about Mozart, Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist. You can go on and on and on of people. The whole idea of reincarnation, even here in this very lodge in Detroit, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, he believed adamantly in reincarnation. He was a firm believer and belonged to this lodge when it was downtown at the Masonic Temple. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company. So there have been a lot of famous people. I mean, you can just, I'm trying to think, Albert Schweitzer. There are presidents and world leaders and kings who have believed and still do. Winston Churchill believed in reincarnation. And a lot of those great people have had tremendous experiences in other lives where they've been very powerful people. I produced a video on the horoscope of John F. Kennedy Jr. about 25 years ago, not too long after he died. And it talks about in this DVD about the horoscope of John Jr. and the karma of the Kennedy family. And of course, they have died violent deaths, the Kennedys. We all know about that. But what is the reason for it? And it's said in esoteric circles that they were a group of Roman Caesars who had violent karma. And they incarnated as a family unit to pay off this karma. And when you think about how they died and the violence, and young Joe Kennedy Jr., old Joe's son, he was trying to get the boy, he was going to make him the president. And he was killed in a horrible airplane accident on a mission in Europe, where the plane they were in was filled with explosives. And they were going to fly this plane, they were going to parachute out, and for whatever reason, static electricity or whatever, the plane blew up. So the oldest of the Kennedy boys, Joe Jr., was killed. And the next one to inherit the mantle, because the father himself, a reincarnated Roman Caesar, wanted power for the family. And he groomed John Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, to be the, hopefully a president, which of course he was, and we all know that story. But the family is filled, and they say in families with immense karma that how many generations does this karma go back into the family? And there was just an event fairly recently. I was stunned when I saw it. Does anybody remember what it was? It was one of the young Kennedy children. I don't know if it was a little girl.
It was a teenage girl.
Yeah, teenage girl. And what was it? Do you remember the event?
Drug overdose.
Drug overdose. See, it's another Kennedy and another generation. That's what I'm talking about. How many generations does this karma go back, and how will it release itself? It's extraordinary stuff to think about. And if you're interested in metaphysics and you're interested in esoteric things like I am, you think about those things and you try to find answers for them. But we're all evolving, we're all moving, and we are all immortal beings, immortal souls. About 1 million years. It takes about 1 million years. We say symbolically 777 lives, but maybe 1,000 lives. Depends. There's no set number. There is no set number. But that 777 that I wrote up on the board explains symbolically in a very, I think in a very accurate way, the whole idea of an enormous amount of lives struggling to a plateau where realizations begin to take place, and then a final plateau where a completion of the purpose of the individual soul is complete, and we enter into a higher kingdom, which we call the kingdom of souls, or the fifth kingdom in nature. And of course, there are great stories when you read the esoteric classics about leaders and people who have evolved to a very high degree of attainment in all races and all religions, all nations. They exist. I've been fortunate in my lifetime. I've met some really extraordinary people. I've always had a mentor. I've always had, when I was a little boy, we weren't Catholic, my family, but the Catholic priest we lived in a small town. He came to our house for Sunday dinner. Well, you can imagine the uproar over that. He wasn't going to any of the Catholic peoples. He liked my mother and he liked my dad, and they just liked one another. That's all. And so the Catholic priest came to my house for Sunday dinner in a community of about 2,500 people, which was predominantly a Catholic community. May have been some karmic link there between my parents and the priest. Who knows? I don't know. I haven't explored that. Maybe someday it'll be made known to me. But we've all had these unusual experiences, and we've had things that have happened to us that make us wonder about things that we're fond of. But there are indications in the horoscope. When we look at people's horoscopes, if we're trained properly, we can look at a horoscope and we can see the karma. We can see if the karma is violent, if the karma is benign. I have a horoscope here somewhere. I don't know what I did with it. Anybody see that, Randy, where that went? Oh, yeah, I had a chart. Here, it's right here. I just use this. I've talked about it before. Some of you have seen this, but my chart is an unusual chart by virtue of the fact that it's easy to interpret. It's really very easy to interpret. And one of the things that we say is that Saturn, where we find Saturn in the horoscope. Saturn is karma that is long-term, ancient karma, going back, who knows, to Atlantis. Even Lemuria, there are people who are born with Lemurian karma. Lemuria was before Atlantis, and they have Lemurian karma, and a lot of times there'll be people who will be born with things like elephantiasis. Manly Hall, the great philosopher and teacher out in Los Angeles, Rosicrucian, wrote an immense book, a great big book. I have one at home, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Suffered from being this enormous, gigantic man with this, what must have been Lemurian karma, an immense physical body that was gross, very good. I sat in his chair one time. He was friends of a friend of mine. And the chair, I felt like a little kid, you know. I mean, I weigh 190 pounds, and I sat in this gigantic chair, and this was his chair. It was a brutally handsome man. I have a picture at my home. Sometimes I give lectures at my home. We're hoping to start to do that again this winter. And have potluck dinners, and you're all invited, usually on a Saturday or a Sunday night. And I give a talk, or somebody gives a talk, and then we have this potluck dinner that we share. And I remember I'm going back to the Manly Hall event. He died a strange death too, but certainly when you see those sorts of things, they are Lemurian in their origin, because the Lemurian people were huge, giant people, and there may be a connection between that particular disease, which is Lemurian, it's said, and some karma that Manly Hall was finally paying off. It doesn't always happen instantly. We talk about instant karma, and certainly there's karma that is instant. You know, it seems instantaneous, but there's karma of immense long periods of time. I had a lady I was very close to for a number of years, and she had a violent karma in her horoscope where Mars, like the Kennedys, Mars and Saturn, were poorly aspected in her horoscope, and it showed a bloody, violent karma. And you have to be careful what you tell people, you know. They come to you, they want their horoscope done, and you look into the horoscope, and sometimes there's some things in there that can be frightening. And so I try not to do that anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore. So one of the things that we see in my horoscope is that it's in the 11th house. And of course, the esoteric ruler in esoteric astrology of the 11th house is Aquarius. And its ruler is Jupiter. Jupiter is the esoteric ruler of Aquarius, and it's the most benign of all of the planets. And so it means that my karma and my friends are karmic. My karma is benign. I've had terrible things that have happened to me in my life, but I've always been able to recover from it and turn it to good account, whether it was Vietnam or some tragedy that happened. Usually the death of loved ones. But you persevere, and you have to. It takes a lot of willpower, and life isn't always fair. And it can be harsh and cruel, to say the least. I think what I would like to do now, I just wanted to point out, though, this aspect. And then over here, see, here's another. This is short-term karma, is Mars. And so when people come to you and they're trying to understand their lives, we say, well, he's got Mars in Gemini. And Gemini splits and divides, and it also rules things that come in pairs. It was interesting, the story I told you about my vision, conscious mediumship, where I saw the World Trade Towers on September 1st, 2001, collapsing, imploding on top of one another, that the moon, on September 11th, 2001, the moon had transited Gemini. The moon was in Gemini and was transiting across the cosmos, and it may have triggered, I believe it did, it triggered the destruction of those two towers, which represent symbolically the Roman numeral 2. This represents the Roman numeral 2. And so what this means in my horoscope is I have this short-term karma thing where I'm accident prone. And every time I try to bring the groceries and the laundry up from the basement at the same time using both hands, I know after only 50 years or so, I finally figured it out, that there's going to be an accident and I'm going to drop the groceries, or the bag's going to tear, or the laundry basket is going to fall down the stairs with all the clean clothes. And that's really what that means. It also means things like long distance travel, ninth house, higher education, and it means like don't ever get on a motorcycle in Europe. Two-wheeled vehicle. It all fits, and it works. The astrology does work. The new astrology, not the old astrology. I'm a neo, like I said, I'm a neo-theosophist, and my perspectives are a little different and sometimes controversial, but I have broad shoulders and can withstand the derision. So, okay, Randy, we're going to try to advance this here. Hosanna. The law of conservation of matter states that you cannot destroy matter, but its state can change. The law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be destroyed, just change from one form to another. And of course, that's what's happening to the physical body. The physical body may die, but it continues on. It has an astral vehicle, and that astral vehicle enters the astral world. The problem that we have now, this is new stuff I'm talking about tonight, is that we now live in a world where there are over 7 billion people. There have never been, that we know of, this many people on this planet. And what's happening on the inner planes is that the wheel of rebirth is speeding up. Over 1/10 of these 63 billion monads are in incarnation. During the Ice Age, 100 years ago, 10 or 20,000 people on the entire planet. Now we have over 7 billion. And they produce a pressure on this thing we call the wheel of rebirth, which I'll get to. And that wheel is speeding up. I remember just reading several years ago an article of a little boy in India who was born, and he remembered his parents from the previous life and the grandfather. And it was documented by people in India, doctors who documented these events. And I have memories of not just my life in World War II, but I had a life I remembered about 500 years ago during the time of Shakespeare. I had another memory of a life, excuse me, about 1,000 years ago that took place in also in England. And I've always had, as a little boy, an affinity for England. I had English friends. My parents, after World War II, sponsored families from England through the church. And I was quite close to some of those families who moved to America. So,
could you comment on the last sentence on this slide? Can you go?
There is no death.
This can go beyond your karma. Can you use up your? It says until reincarnation ceases. So is it?
You can neutralize your karma And it's something that every one of us can do. You know, I used to tell people who were dying, they would say, what can I do? I said, well, practice harmlessness. We would tell people. Like the ashram that I was a part of for many, many years, still am really connected. We tell people, practice harmlessness. Try to do that even now. You're not on your deathbed. You've got years ahead of you. Practice harmlessness towards people, you know. It helps neutralize karma. You can neutralize your karma by good deeds. It's easy to say. It's not always easy to do. But karma really ceases ultimately when you, unfortunately, when we have experienced all of the bad stuff that this planet can offer us. That's usually what it boils down to. Then, once you've experienced all the pain and suffering, then you're freed. You're freed from the bonds of the world. Some people it just takes longer than others. You know, we say they're the path of Capricorn. People who are on Capricorn, it's straight to the top, where for everybody else it's kind of around and around and around. It may take 1,000 lives, where you can take a shortcut and go straight to the mountain top, symbolically speaking. And you do that by a lot of suffering, by taking on difficult lives and surmounting the obstacles that life throws at you. If you're not suffering much, you're not growing much. What does Blavatsky say? Woe to those who live without suffering. Yeah.
Once the karma is satisfied and reincarnation ceases, is that when you go into the next kingdom?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, fifth kingdom. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the lords of karma make sure that we pay our debts. Like I say, there are things that you can do to neutralize karma. And we need to think about those things, what it is that we can do. Yeah. There we go. That's the one we want right here. This will explain the wheel of rebirth. And I've told you the wheel of rebirth is speeding up because there are more souls in manifestation than ever before, and that exerts a pressure. And that pressure is causing the wheel of rebirth to speed up. So the time between death and life, rebirth, is speeding up. And when I was 3 and 4 years old, it would have been 1950. 1951, I was born in 47. The war ended in 45, 1945. Millions of people were killed in the war, and many of those reincarnated. I think it was Edgar Casey said that we would see too in the Red American Indians would reincarnate among what we call the hippies, and they would wear beads and adornments that would be similar to something that you might subscribe to a Red American Indian. I can remember guys in Vietnam, young hippie type guys in Vietnam, they were there too, and they'd wear beads. Guys would always try to be buying beads from the local people that lived out in the hinterlands. So anyway, this is the physical plane down here. This is the astral plane. This is the mental plane, the Buddhic plane, the Atmic plane, the monadic plane, and of course the Logoic, where the Logos resides. No one can move beyond the Logos. It's called the ring pass knot because then you become a Logos and you have your own solar system. So we call it the ring pass knot. But what happens at death is that depending upon the age of the soul, you move in through these higher planes, the mental plane. You may move in as high as the Buddhic plane, and then eventually reincarnate. The old teachings would say, well, you'd have a life about every 1,000 years or so. And that may have been true when the population of the world was much, much less than it is right now. But things change. They change in the astral world, and the proof is these books that are right there on those bookshelves of young children who remember dying in World War II just like me, only they remember more than I do. And they carry these memories with them. There was a book over there, a little boy was a pilot in the Army Air Corps, they used to call it the Air Force and the Army Air Corps, and he remembered his mates, his buddies. He remembered the numbers on his plane that he flew. And his father finally got sick and tired of hearing about it, and he researched it and investigated and found his buddies. They found these guys, and he knew their names, and he looked at a little kid, and he was like 6, 7, 9 years old, maybe. Extraordinary stuff. The world's full of stories like that.
Tell me about the soul in terms of being individuated from the source.
Mhm.
And when you die, if you go back,
Mhm.
is there a chance that you become integrated, or can your soul divide?
Eventually, yeah, there is integration. It's integration into these higher planes, but if you've evolved into a 6th degree initiate or a 7th degree initiate being, a lot of times these souls come in like Krishnamurti did from another system, higher souls. Certainly there are souls that on our earth chain, even though the life of our earth is, and it's the process intertwined. You mean like twin souls or something, or what?
If you're kind of going back to a source,
Mhm.
is it possible that you are still individual in terms of your soul energy, or do you kind of go back into this sort of pluralism of all these souls, and can you leave with just your own soul, or are you part of a bigger collective?
We're all a part of the collective, but we're expressing ourselves individually here on the earth chain of evolution. And eventually, at some point, we take these higher initiations, the Aquarian age is the age of groups, and it's the age of group initiation. And the problem that we have in the world is that nobody knows what that is, because we haven't had it before, at least not in 75,000 years, at least that long. So all these people that are out there talking about their individual growth, we're now entering the Aquarian age. And the Aquarian age is an age of groups, and it's the group initiation, and it's the group experience. That's what Aquarius is. And the world is really going to start to change rapidly. The prophecy says that 2025 is the externalization of the spiritual hierarchy. And if you look at 1875, when the society, the Theosophical Society, was formed, and you look at 50-year increments, 1925, 1975, 2025, those are 50-year increments. 2025 is, like I said, it's like 5 years and 2 months away, and it'll be 2025. And that's when this externalization of these high spiritual beings, who have always been there, some number, few, but now more, larger numbers, I believe, will start to incarnate. They may already be in the world. I believe some of them are. I won't go into any detail, but I'm sure they are. And there'll be more of them. And I don't know exactly how they will manifest themselves, but some of them might be scientists. Some of them might be just that you could imagine. Almost incognito in a way, disguised. What does the Bible say? He will come like a thief in the night. Is that right? He will come like talking about Christ. Christ being. Maybe there says there are many Buddhas and many Christs who are waiting to come in. Parents, esoteric parents, I would think, who can give an environment to these children where they can nurture these children and bring out these high qualities. I had one. My wife, true story, used to sleep in my den where I meditate, and on a green sofa. When you come to my house, you can see it. And she came upstairs one night, and she shook me. Dave, wake up! Wake up, Dave! What is it? You're never going to believe what happened. This was a woman who had no spiritual life. It even indicated it in her horoscope, no spiritual life. And she said, I was asleep, and I heard this beautiful music, and I looked up, and there was a ball of light. My ex-wife, who had no spiritual life. There was a ball of light, and the ball of light began to move around the room, and it bounced off the wall, and then off of this wall, and then off the floor, and then it went up to the ceiling, and then it moved around the ceiling. And she said, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid. It was this beautiful feeling that came over me, and it moved around the room, and then it came down through the top of my head into my womb, where the baby is. What does that mean? And I said, this is a super gifted child. And she was a super gifted child who died at 16 years of age in a horrific automobile accident that involved 7 children who were all 16 years old, and my daughter was the only one that was hurt in a split second. But they come in for a purpose. They have a purpose, see. There's something they're doing, something, and I've had contact with my deceased daughter, so I know reincarnation is real. I was going to give a lecture one time years ago to 600 people. And they had this woman that was on ahead of me, and she was one of these New Age whack jobs who just confused the whole thing. And I thought, my God, how am I ever going to follow that? How will I ever follow that? And just then I heard my daughter's voice. She'd been dead for about a year and a half. And I went down into that auditorium. I had been upstairs in the hallway of a huge hotel. And I went back down into the auditorium because her talk was so bad I couldn't stand it. I had to leave, and that's when I had the experience with my daughter. And I was next. I was the next speaker. And a woman named Jean Greening was the MC. Wonderful soul. And she said our next speaker is David Zimmerman. And they had these talented man and woman, young couple, married, and they began to play the Age of Aquarius. And the whole aura and complexion of that audience changed. And they were all singing. You know the song, The Age of Aquarius. And the woman of this man and wife team was a trained opera singer and had a beautiful voice. And she was leading the group. And that was my intro to this group to give my lecture. And it like I said, it took all of that, whatever that energy was that woman had, and re-energized that entire room of 600 people. And it allowed me, it was like a prayer was answered that I didn't even pray, but somebody was on my side. And I gave this talk. But I remember my daughter speaking to me in the hallway as I was waiting for the elevator to go down to the conference room where I was going to give this talk. And that changed me. I was instantly energized by my daughter's voice. Those things do happen. And so you want to look for those and write them down in your spiritual diary, which you should all keep, a spiritual diary. I don't know what else we've got here. We've got question and answer. I don't know, Randy, it's not picking it up here. There we go. The permanent atom. We need to talk a little bit about the permanent atom, how heredity and karma and all those things are working through this instrument we call the permanent atom, which influences our own genes and chromosomes. And we're born with a certain body and certain heredity. And it tells us a part of a story about ourselves. And it can carry with it karmic and atavistic influences, no doubt. And it's interesting when you see the Dr. Babbitt in New York 140 years ago or something drew his perception of an atom and has been since confirmed by powerful initiate teachers. But the swirls, the vortex and the torrent of this heart-shaped permanent atom also parallels the shape of the muscles of a human heart. And I always tell people in my lectures that a lot of times people think that the soul is in the brain, somewhere in the brain, but it's actually seated in the region of the heart. It's an interesting thought. This is a little bit controversial, but initiate people I have known have certain groups, circles that I have been involved in. The karma of Stephen Hawking's scientist, and how he in a previous life was Galileo Galilei, who had discovered a mystery of the rotation of the planets around the sun, which was in direct defiance of the teachings of the Catholic Church. And they had threatened to kill him if he did not take back his statements, which he did to save his life. And I can remember a college professor in the first year of college talking about this. But it's believed by certain initiate teachers who I've had contact with in my life that Stephen Hawkins, is it Hawking, was the reincarnation of Galileo, and that his deformed body was a karmic retribution for not standing up to the Catholic Church. I'm just throwing it out there as an idea, something to think about. It's interesting. Oops. It's not going in the direction it's supposed to. I'd like to get to the next slide as soon as possible.
I guess you gotta scroll the other way.
Yeah, it's just slow. It's responding. It's, for some reason, it's really slow.
That's been like that in this neighborhood.
Sir Francis Bacon is the Count Saint Germain. I don't know if I believe this or not. It was something that was given to me. There are esoteric groups who say that Saint Germain was in fact incarnating as Sir Francis Bacon. I lived with an elderly man and woman who used to lecture in esoteric circles. They were controversial, but he was an extraordinary human being. His name was Dr. Joseph Busby. He never went to school beyond the age of 14, and he had 60 honorary doctorate degrees from major schools throughout the world. He said, when this man spoke, I knew him well, I lived with him for a time. When he spoke, his words were supercharged, he said, with cosmic fire. And I have seen him speak to a room, hundreds of people in a room. And the words that came from this man's mouth were so powerful that people would just weep uncontrollably. True story. He told me stories that he had had with various masters, and one of them was Saint Germain. Amazing stories. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to tell you about it because it's part of my life. He had a box of gemstones, a little wooden box. I saw it. I held the stones in my hands. The box was this big, about like that, about that high. Incredible gemstones. There were diamonds, green beryl aquamarines. There was a giant citrine that was the size of a double-yolked turkey egg. He said that these stones had been materialized by Saint Germain and were given to him. I can't prove it. I can't disprove it. I saw the stones. There were women. This is in Cape Town, South Africa, just outside of Cape. Is about 40 years ago. And there were women who took those stones to a gemologist in Cape Town, and the gemologist said that he could not put a price on the stones, that he'd never seen anything like it in his life. There was no price he could put on them. I don't know. He had contact. He said that there were a group of masters, 4 or 5 masters, that were using his throat chakra. And he would give out these talks. I have tapes, got 100 or more cassette tapes, the old cassette tapes from years ago of his lectures that were decidedly Piscean. They were Christian-like, kind of an energy about them. But I know that when that man spoke, and I have people that will testify, that stood right beside me that were there, and they said they'd never heard anything like it in their lives. So there are people out there. There are unusual people that may come into your life as you tread the path, and they will enrich your life in some very mysterious way. It changed my life, I can tell you that. In fact, he had described me. I met him in Chicago at a huge event at the Ramada O'Hare Hotel, and he had described me to his family and friends. This is an interesting picture. Socrates drinking the hemlock, but I wanted to tell you about this. I had heard only one story about this Dr. Busby fellow. I may have had a karmic link with him, I don't know. And I always wanted to meet him because there was such an unusual story about this man, and how a friend of mine had known him, and he was traveling America, mostly through Theosophical Societies. Nobody remembers him because it was so many years ago that they're all dead now. And this friend of mine, college professor, a well-known theosophist to people up in Wheaton, was home with his wife, and they were preparing a dinner because Dr. Busby was going to come over to their house and eat. And they were talking about the evolution of the earth and how Sanat Kumara had brought, Lord of the World, had brought certain things from the Venusian evolution to Earth to aid in the Earth evolution. And there were three things that they were trying to think of, and one of them was bees that are the most unaerodynamic flying objects in the world, and that by earthly scientific theory it's impossible for them to fly, and yet they fly. And they pollinate our plants and keep us alive. They contribute tremendously to the cycle of life in the plant kingdom. Bees and wheat. Bees and wheat. And there was a third thing, and they couldn't think of it. So my friend, college professor friend, had to drive out in the country to an estate. A very wealthy family were friends of his, this Dr. Busby, and he picked him up, and he said Busby was waiting for him, and when he got in the car, he looked at my friend, and he answered the third question. Grapes. Bees, wheat, and grapes came from Venusian evolution. And when you take communion, you take the wheat wafer and you drink the grape wine. Remember that? And it has a Venusian connotation and a very profound meaning to some people. Anyway, Socrates drank the hemlock. Now, one of the things that happened was that the day before Socrates met Plato, he had a dream vision. And in the dream vision, we're talking about reincarnation and atavism and some unusual things here. This is a little bit related to that. He had a vision of a swan. And he knew, Socrates, when he had this vision of a swan, that a beautiful soul was going to come to him, and the next day Plato walked through the door. And they say in certain esoteric schools that when Socrates drank the hemlock, he did so willingly because he knew that he would ensoul the body of Plato, and that Plato and Socrates were one and the same. It's worth thinking about. I don't know what's next here. I apologize for this machine. It's just not doing. Robin Williams. I had an experience that told me something about Robin Williams in a previous life of his as a black comedian who W.C. Fields said was the funniest man in the world. He said Burt Williams, the old-time vaudeville guy, said Burt Williams was the funniest man that ever lived. W.C. Fields said Burt Williams was how did he say that? Burt Williams was the funniest man I ever saw and the saddest man I ever knew. Was Burt Williams, who collapsed on the floor of the Gem Theater in the 1920s in Detroit. And they were able to get him on a train to Harlem in New York, where he eventually died. He was very wealthy. He was probably the richest black man in America in those days. And people loved this guy. But he was discriminated against. And it broke his heart. And my experience in unraveling a mystery came to me through very mysterious means, was that he reincarnated as Robin Williams, who people said was the funniest man I ever saw and the saddest man I ever knew, and he eventually took his own life. It's worth thinking about. Maybe it's true. Maybe it isn't. There he is, Robin Williams. And blackface. Look at that. He's got clay or something. It's not really. Barack Obama was Thomas Jefferson. I can't prove it or disprove it, but there are some very unusual things if you study the similarities in Barack Obama's life, where if he was Thomas Jefferson, of all of the founding fathers, prolonged slavery by 80 years. It took Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, to end it. He ended slavery. And all black people up until 1932, they always voted Republican. They don't anymore. He maintained 147 black slaves, Thomas Jefferson, that he had inherited from his father-in-law. And when he inherited those 140 black slaves, he didn't want an emancipation for the slaves. He wanted to keep them. And he had a mulatto wife named Sally Hemings, who he had 5 or 6 children from, and 2 of them died. She was a beautiful woman. I have a caricature drawn of her, and she looked like Lena Horne. And he got her pregnant when she was about 15 or 16 years old and had these children with her. Obama himself was neither black nor white. He was a mulatto. And he had these mulatto children that he would not recognize, Thomas Jefferson, until he died. So Thomas Jefferson wasn't necessarily the saint that history has made him out to be. That's the plantation. There's some plans of it. These are some of his statements. Some artifacts found there at Monticello. There's the family lineage, some of it. There's Obama with his grandparents. Birth horoscope of Thomas Jefferson. I'm not sure how accurate that really is. But Obama's is interesting, and I gave a lecture on it at Olivet College about 8 or 9 years ago. Abraham Lincoln, this is very esoteric stuff, but the Count d'Angerville was said to be the reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln. There's Paracelsus, Swedenborg, Baker, and Eliphas Levi. Just people and who they were. I knew Barbara Cartland. She was a very unusual woman, very wealthy. I used to go to her estate once in a while. Said that she was Edmund Burke in a previous life. Let's see what else I've got in here. Oops. The poet Homer reincarnated as George Chapman. George Chapman was alive at the time of William Shakespeare. George Chapman was said to be one of the only few people in the world who knew who the true author of the Shakespearean plays was, and it wasn't William Shakespeare, who was illiterate and couldn't even write or spell his own name. He in a previous life had been the poet Homer, and it's worth thinking about. He's incarnated in the 20th century. There's a friend of mine, a genius guy. This is an interesting thing because one of the things that has happened with the speeding up of the wheel of rebirth is this whole problem of confused gender identity. And if you've had a lifetime of where you've lived 30 lives as a female and all of a sudden you're abruptly reincarnated within a very short period of time in a man's body, you might be confused about your gender, and that's what's really causing it. So we have just incredible things like that. This lady was white and swore she was black, and it may have had many lives as a black person. And it's all about the reincarnating permanent atoms, really, in the final analysis. So I do have these books for sale. They're $20 a piece. Half the money goes to the lodge. And if you're interested, I'll take some questions. We've got a little time left for a couple of questions. If anybody's wanting to ask something, yeah.
So the 63 billion
Monads.
that are,
Mhm.
that are
Yeah, they're not all in manifestation. 7 billion are over 7 on Earth.
But as they seek that expression, as they seek their expression,
Mhm.
is there a collateral understanding with the rest of us? Or are we all in sync with what these expressions are? Do we understand them?
No, we don't. Higher souls, the more highly evolved, do. But it's like I said, it's like a football shape. These 63 billion souls are at varying degrees of soul growth. Some are younger souls, some are in the middle ground area, and some are very advanced souls. They don't all come into manifestation at once. The Earth couldn't possibly sustain 63 billion monads or souls divine. Couldn't do it. They're worried. Some people say that we may only be able to maintain maybe 10 billion. Some say, 20 billion. I don't know. That's a big number to me. See, I don't know what the Earth can sustain. The problem, too, that compounds it is that people are living longer. And part of the prophecy says that people will live to be 150. Your grandchildren will be 150 years old, and some will live to be 200. And you already got too many people. And one of the things that many people think is coming, it's frightening to think about, is euthanasia. Do you have a question? Somebody? Yeah.
When you say old souls,
Mhm.
are you saying that those souls are nearing the end of their incarnation process?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, they've had more incarnations, or they've grown at a higher rate, have achieved higher degrees of evolution or advancement. Yeah, they may be third and fourth degree initiate beings. Some of them certainly are. You know, like I said, Blavatsky said Buddhists and Christs galore are waiting to incarnate into the world. That's what Blavatsky said. Not one Christ, galore. Numbers that are many, many Christs and many Buddhas, you know. And we know there are masters. How many masters are there? Well, they used to say there were 49. There were 7 masters for each of the 7 planes, or there were 7 masters for, you know, and so that's 49. 7 sevens is 49. But there may be 60, or there may be 1,000. There's entire planets, Venus, where everybody is an advanced soul. That's what the Manasaputras were all about, that interbred with the evolving primitive physical ape-type human beings and changed the entire evolution of humanity on Earth for all time. It's in the writings.
I always think that me and my brother are so different.
Are you twins?
No, we're from the same family, but we're so different in like in personality.
Yeah, my brother and I were that way too. Very different. It's common. Sometimes in the nuclear family, you'll have all these diverse personalities that if you added them all together, it makes a sum total of one life in a way, in a symbolic way. I've seen it in my own family. I've diversity like that in my family. I'm very different. My sisters my entire family were pretty much Christian fundamentalists or fundamentalists of some kind. Fundamentalism is dying out. It's even dying out in theosophy. The fundamentalist theosophy people, theosophists are eventually going to die out, and there'll be a whole new group come in that'll be more open and more receptive to newer teachings. Yeah. Sixth rays dying out.
I have a friend who's a Vedic astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but even with my own knowing,
I like Vedic astrology.
I know, but it's supposedly more accurate than Western Chu claims it because there's 23 degrees off.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I know esoteric astrology works. I stand by it.
But I'm going to claim what I see so far is that we're entering an age of like a new council of souls that's going to.
The Aquarian Age. Yeah, the Aquarian Age, they call it.
But this is what you're saying. But the thing is, I think it's from all star seed to rays, from Orion, etc., are going to change by the time we call 2025. This whole be a whole new, and it's going to be too hard for like even me to fathom that from where I'm at. You understand what I'm saying? The energy.
I think so. Yeah.
Because of all the souls that are here already.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. We don't have long to wait, do
No.
we? Yeah. Involution and evolution.
So as
Yeah.
we are progressing to the higher kingdoms, obviously the material or the matter, plane with the matter which we're living on, I guess Earth, we have like physical bodies.
Uh-huh.
So as we're going through the progression,
Right.
what types of bodies do we have at the kingdoms?
In the what?
The other kingdoms above man. Like
Subtle bodies. They can take on physical form, but they live in mental bodies or no body, don't require a body per se. One of the interesting things that Blavatsky says, and I bring this up from time to time, she says that we are in the nada of the fourth round, and that the Earth is just slightly past its halfway point of its life cycle. Halfway. And we are, as human beings, we're half formed, really. Because what Blavatsky said was, she wrote in the late 1800s, already the Earth is starting to dematerialize. See, the Earth goes through these globes where they're mental globes, they're astral globes, they're etheric globes, they become concrete physical globes, and then they go from a physical globe back into an etheric globe. And the American Indians talked about the seven earths, the astral, and then the mental, and then into what is called intrachain nirvana. So it's worth thinking, but you got to read the books. Secret Doctrine, I highly recommend it. Don't try to sit down and read it all at once. Only a first-rate mind can really do that. The way I read it was, I just read a few pages a day. It took me years, because it's, hundreds and thousands of pages. It's, what is it, 1,500 pages, 1,600 pages. So I just read a few pages a day, every day. Some days I'd read 10 pages, some days, but at least it gave me time to kind of try to assimilate it. Some of it I couldn't, but did later, some of it later down the road. I thought it was interesting on page 500 in volume 2, Blavatsky says in the footnotes, one of the greatest secrets of initiation is astrology. And she ain't talking about mundane astrology. She's talking about esoteric astrology. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what that horoscope of mine is. It's esoteric astrology. And I'm telling you what, it works 100%. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I want to thank every... What? Secret Doctrine is in 2 volumes, Cosmogenesis and Anthropogenesis, but any of the books of Blavatsky, and of the classical teachings. You should always study the classical teachings. You know, people, that's part of the problem. The New Age is filled with confusion and chaos by virtue of the fact that there are all these books people write that are just rewrites of everything that's been already written. You know, it's one of my great aggravations in life. And very few of them have anything new. And sometimes the teachings are so new. When Alice Bailey came out, they all shunned her, you know. She had the same teacher in the end that Blavatsky had, was the Tibetan Dewal Kul, see. But fundamentalists argue that, you know, Blavatsky was pure. I don't want to get involved in that. You figure it out on your own, just like I did. And then others who have come after them. But there's a lot of really good books right here. And like I said, these books on reincarnation, if you want to understand it, we're going to donate half the money to the lodge. The 1990, what was it, 6 price on this book was $15. So, 1995, 24 years ago, it was $15. If I tried to print that book today and sell it, books are bad business if you try to make money off of them. It's so expensive to print, and especially color. I have huge numbers of very esoteric books with color plates. It'd cost you hundreds of dollars to print those books today. You couldn't do it. But we had our own printing presses and slave labor, essentially, free labor of volunteers that lived, you know, at the school that printed the books. If you had to pay people to do it, you couldn't do it. So, any other questions before we call it a night? I want to thank everybody for coming. You asked really good questions. I hope I made some sense to you. I hope that my enemies don't try to crucify me too bad, but I'm always, I have broad shoulders and can withstand the derision. So, thank you. Thank you very much.